Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. You're standing in a grove at twilight, and the air smells faintly of crushed grapes and wild herbs. Somewhere in the distance, drums begin to pulse, slowly at first, then faster. A flute joins in, its melody winding like smoke through the trees. And then you hear it. Voices. Women's voices, rising in a cry that's neither quite human nor entirely divine. They're calling a name. Dionysus. And with that name comes something electric, something dangerous, something that makes your pulse quicken and your inhibitions loosen their grip. Tonight, we're stepping into the world of one of the strangest, most contradictory, and perhaps most misunderstood gods in the entire Greek pantheon. Dionysus. God of wine, yes, but also so much more. God of theater and masks, of ritual madness and ecstatic release, of death and rebirth, of the wild places where civilization ends and something older takes over. He's the god who makes you forget yourself, who tears down the walls you've built around who you think you are, and shows you something raw and real underneath. The Greeks didn't quite know what to make of him either. Unlike Zeus with his thunderbolts or Athena with her wisdom, Dionysus operated in the spaces between sanity and madness, between joy and terror, between the structured world of the city and the untamed wilderness beyond its walls. He was a god who could bring the greatest pleasures or the most horrifying vengeance. He could grant you transcendence or drive you to tear your own family apart with your bare hands. And here's the beautiful, terrifying paradox at the heart of Dionysus. He was both completely Greek and fundamentally foreign. He appears in the earliest Greek texts we have, his name scratched into tablets from the Mycenaean period, dating back to the 13th or 12th century before the Common Era. And yet the Greeks themselves thought of him as an outsider, a god who came from somewhere else, bringing strange rites and dangerous ideas from the mysterious East. Thebes claimed him as a native son, born to Princess Semele within their walls. But his worship always felt like something imported, something that didn't quite fit the neat marble columns and rational philosophy that Greece would become famous for. Maybe that's why he mattered so much. In a culture increasingly obsessed with reason, with democracy, with clear laws and logical arguments, Dionysus represented everything that couldn't be rationalized away, the part of human experience that doesn't make sense in the daylight, the need to let go, to lose control, to step outside yourself. The Greeks, for all their philosophy and their architecture, understood something crucial. They understood that sometimes you need to go a little mad. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand what Dionysus meant to the Greeks, before we can stand with the Maenads on the mountain and feel what they felt, before we can see why his festivals gave birth to the very concept of theater as we know it, we need to start at the beginning. And Dionysus's beginning is characteristically unlike any other god's story, because Dionysus wasn't just born once, he was born twice, and the second time his father gave birth to him, from his thigh. Yes, you heard that correctly. Greek mythology never did things halfway, and Dionysus's origin story is genuinely one of the strangest, most symbolic tales in the entire pantheon. So let's go back to Thebes, back to a young princess named Semele, back to the moment when Zeus, king of the gods, made one of his characteristically poor relationship decisions. Thebes, the great city founded by Cadmus, who followed a cow until it lay down, just as the oracle had instructed, and there built his kingdom, the city where Oedipus would later unravel his tragic fate, where the house of Cadmus would see glory and catastrophe in equal measure. And in this city, among the royal family, lived a young woman named Semele, beautiful, mortal, and about to become entangled with divine power in the most dangerous possible way. Zeus noticed her. Of course he did. Zeus had a rather well-documented habit of noticing attractive mortals, much to the perpetual fury of his wife, Hera. And when Zeus noticed someone, he pursued them, regardless of the consequences. In Semele's case, he began visiting her in secret. The king of the gods, lord of the sky and thunder, conducting a clandestine affair with a Theban princess. One can almost admire the audacity if one conveniently ignores the power dynamics and the inevitable divine catastrophe waiting to unfold. Semele became pregnant. The child growing within her was half mortal, half divine, a demigod in the making. and this was where Hera entered the picture. Now, we should pause here and acknowledge something about Hera. Modern retellings often paint her as a jealous, vengeful shrew, eternally punishing Zeus's lovers for his infidelity. But consider her position for a moment. She was the queen of the gods, goddess of marriage and family, trapped in a union with a husband who serially violated every principle she represented. Her rage, while often misdirected toward Zeus's victims rather than Zeus himself, came from somewhere real. In Semele's case, Hera's vengeance was particularly cunning. She disguised herself as an old woman, perhaps Semele's nurse, and befriended the pregnant princess. Picture them sitting together, Hera in her false form offering advice, slowly planting seeds of doubt. "How do you know he's really Zeus?" she whispered. "Any man could claim to be a god. How do you know he's telling the truth? You've never seen his true form, have you? You've never seen him in all his divine glory?" The seed took root. Semele began to wonder. And when Zeus visited her again, she asked him for a favor. She made him promise by the river Styx to grant her one wish, whatever it might be. And Zeus, besotted and foolish, swore the oath. The Styx oath was unbreakable, even for the king of the gods. Once given, it bound absolutely. Zeus had just signed Semele's death warrant without knowing it. Semele made her wish. "Show yourself to me," she said, "in your true form, as you appear to Hera. I want to see you as you really are." Zeus tried to dissuade her. He knew what would happen. Gods in their true forms were not meant for mortal eyes. Divine power at full strength was too much for human flesh to withstand, but the oath was sworn, and it could not be broken. He had no choice. Zeus appeared to Semele in his true form, radiant with divine power, wreathed in lightning and thunder, and Semele, mortal and fragile, was consumed instantly, burned away by the very sight of divinity, unfiltered. But the baby was still viable. In the moment before Semele's death, in the fraction of a second as she burned, Zeus acted. He snatched the unborn child from her womb, the child who would be Dionysus, premature and tiny, clinging to life. Zeus couldn't save Semele, but he could save their son, and so he did something that sounds absurd, that feels almost comical when you first hear it, but which carries profound symbolic weight once you think about it. He sewed the baby into his thigh. Zeus, king of the gods, made an incision in his own divine flesh and placed the unborn Dionysus inside, stitching the wound closed. The baby would gestate there, inside Zeus's body, until he was ready to be born. And when that time came, months later, Zeus gave birth to his son. A god was born from another god's body, without a mother's involvement in the final stages. Dionysus became the twice-born god, once from his mother's womb, once from his father's thigh. Now, the Greeks didn't tell this story just because they enjoyed the bizarre imagery, though they certainly seemed to appreciate it. The story carried layers of meaning. Dionysus's unusual birth marked him as special, as different from every other god on Olympus. He was born from both mortal and divine parents, bridging the gap between the two worlds. He died, in a sense, when Semele died, and he was cut from her womb. But he was reborn, given new life by his father. Death and rebirth, the central themes of Dionysus's mythology, were built into his very origin. And there's something else. By being sewn into Zeus's thigh and born from him, Dionysus became unquestionably legitimate. No one could deny his divinity. No one could claim he was just the bastard child of one of Zeus's affairs, another demigod to file alongside Heracles and Perseus. Dionysus was born from Zeus himself. That made him fully divine, a god in his own right, entitled to a place on Mount Olympus despite his mother's mortality. After his unusual birth, Dionysus couldn't stay on Olympus. Hera's rage hadn't diminished, and Zeus feared for his son's safety, so the baby was spirited away to a mythical place called Nysa. The ancient sources disagree wildly about where Nysa actually was. Some placed it in Ethiopia, beyond Egypt. Others put it in India or Libya or Thrace or any number of distant exotic locations. The name itself may come from the word for nymph, suggesting that Nysa wasn't so much a real place as an idea. a mythological realm where gods could be safely raised away from Olympian politics. Wherever it was, Dionysus was raised there by nymphs, the Maenads they were called, a group of divine nursemaids who cared for the twice-born god in his infancy and childhood. Some versions say the satyr Silenus was his tutor, teaching him about nature and wine. Other traditions involve Hermes delivering the baby, or Zeus briefly transforming Dionysus into a goat to hide him from Hera. The details vary, but the core remains constant. Dionysus grew up far from the centers of civilization, surrounded by wild nature and rustic spirits, learning mysteries that the other Olympians never knew. This isolated upbringing left its mark. Unlike the other gods who were raised on Olympus or in the great cities of Greece, Dionysus's formative years were spent in liminal spaces, in the wilderness, in places where the rules of civilization didn't apply. And when he came of age, when he was ready to claim his divinity and spread his worship, he didn't go straight to Olympus. Instead, he wandered. He traveled the world, teaching mortals the cultivation of the vine, showing them how to make wine, gathering followers, establishing his rites. Dionysus became the wandering god, the traveling deity who moved from place to place, never quite settling, never quite belonging. But there's another version of his birth, older and stranger, that comes from the Orphic traditions. In this telling, Dionysus was first called Zagreus, and he was the son of Zeus and Persephone, queen of the underworld. The infant Zagreus was destined to rule the cosmos, to be Zeus's successor. But Hera, jealous as always, convinced the Titans to attack the baby. The Titans found Zagreus, distracted him with toys and mirrors, and then tore him apart. They ripped the infant god limb from limb in an act of horrifying violence called sparagmos. Then they cooked his dismembered body and ate it, consuming the divine child. But Athena saved Zagreus' heart. She rescued it from the carnage and brought it to Zeus, and from that heart, Dionysus was reborn. Zeus swallowed the heart, or in some versions gave it to Semele to swallow, and from it came Dionysus, the resurrected god. As for the Titans, Zeus struck them down with lightning, burning them to ash, and from those ashes, according to Orphic teaching, humanity was born. This meant that humans carried within them both the divine essence of Dionysus, whom the Titans had consumed, and the base, violent nature of the Titans themselves. We are both god and monster, light and dark, eternally torn between our better and worse natures. The Orphic version is darker, more violent, more explicitly about death and resurrection. It made Dionysus a god of transformation in the most literal sense. He was torn apart and reassembled. He experienced death and came back from it. This version deeply influenced the mystery cults that would later form around Dionysian worship, cults that promised initiates their own form of death and rebirth, their own transformation and salvation. Whether you prefer the story of the thigh or the story of Zagreus, the message is the same. Dionysus was different. His very existence was liminal, transitional, transformative. He was born from death, born from the space between mortal and divine, born from the catastrophic collision of human ambition and divine power. And when he grew to maturity and set out to claim his place in the world, he would carry that liminality with him, spreading it everywhere he went. Imagine being a god and yet not having a home among the gods. That was Dionysus's peculiar position, born divine, twice over, yet never quite accepted. The other Olympians had their domains, their temples, their clearly defined roles in the cosmic order. Zeus ruled the sky, Poseidon the seas, Hades the underworld. Athena had Athens, Apollo had Delphi. But Dionysus wandered. He emerged from his hidden childhood, ready to claim his birthright, ready to be recognized as a god. But recognition doesn't come easily, even for the divine. Dionysus had to prove himself. He had to demonstrate his power. And he did this not through grand battles or displays of cosmic might, but through wine and ritual, through teaching mortals a new way to approach the sacred, through building his cult, one convert at a time. The ancient sources describe Dionysus traveling to the far corners of the known world. He went east, to India, leading an expedition that seems part conquest, part missionary journey, part ecstatic procession. He crossed into Thrace, the wild lands north of Greece where the people were considered barbaric and dangerous. He visited Libya, Egypt, and countless other places, always moving, always spreading knowledge of the vine and the mysteries of his worship. And everywhere he went, he met resistance. Kings tried to stop him. Rulers attempted to ban his rites. Religious authorities condemned his followers as immoral and dangerous. Because Dionysus's worship was threatening. It wasn't like the orderly sacrifices to Zeus or the solemn rituals at Athena's temples. Dionysian worship involved wine and dancing, ecstatic frenzy, and the breaking down of social hierarchies. Women left their homes to dance on mountains. Slaves and citizens mingled freely in his rites. The normal rules didn't apply when Dionysus was present, and that terrified people in power. Take Lycurgus, king of Thrace. When Dionysus arrived in his kingdom, Lycurgus saw the wild dancing, saw the women abandoning their domestic duties to follow this strange god into the hills, and he decided to put a stop to it. He tried to arrest Dionysus, to imprison the god and his followers, to drive them out of Thrace by force. In the earliest version of the story, from Homer's Iliad, Lycurgus chased the nurses of the frenzied Dionysus through the holy hills of Nysa, striking them with his ox goad while they dropped their sacred implements. Dionysus himself fled, diving into the sea where the goddess Thetis sheltered him. But gods don't forget, and gods certainly don't forgive. Later versions of the myth describe Lycurgus's punishment in graphic detail. Dionysus drove him mad. The king, in his insanity, thought he was pruning a vine when he was actually attacking his own son, hacking the boy to pieces with an axe. When the madness lifted and Lycurgus realized what he had done, it was too late. His kingdom fell into famine, the land refusing to bear fruit until Lycurgus was punished. The Thracians, desperate, tied their king to a mountain and left him there to be torn apart by wild horses. Or in other versions, the gods themselves punished him, either blinding him or driving him to further madness and self-destruction. The message was clear. You don't oppose Dionysus. You don't try to suppress his worship. The god of wine and madness has particular tools at his disposal, and they're more intimate, more personal, more psychologically devastating than a lightning bolt from Zeus. Dionysus gets inside your head. He twists your perceptions. He makes you destroy what you love most, and only then does he let you see what you've done. But why all this resistance? Why did kings and rulers across the ancient world try to stop Dionysian worship? The answer lies in what that worship represented. Dionysus offered release, not just from daily concerns or physical labor, but from identity itself. In his rites, a Greek housewife could become a Maenad, a frenzied woman with supernatural strength. A slave could dance alongside a free citizen. The old could feel young, the restrained could go wild, the rational mind could surrender to ecstatic possession. This was revolutionary, and revolutions make rulers nervous. The social order of ancient Greece was rigid, carefully maintained, built on clear hierarchies of gender, class, and status. Dionysian worship threatened all of that. It suggested that there was value, that there was something sacred in abandoning those hierarchies. In the organized Greek city-state, the polis with its laws and councils and debates, Dionysus represented the opposite principle, the principle of letting go. And yet, despite the resistance, Dionysus's cult spread. It spread because people needed it. They needed the release he offered. They needed the permission to step outside themselves. The kings who opposed him usually ended badly, torn apart by their own families, or driven mad or consumed by divine punishment. And gradually, reluctantly, the Greeks accepted that Dionysus was here to stay. They couldn't fight him. They could only find a way to make room for him. Eventually, Dionysus even gained a seat on Olympus. He became one of the 12 Olympians, though his position was always somewhat ambiguous. In some lists, he replaced Hestia, goddess of the hearth. In others, he was included from the beginning. The exact composition of the 12 varied depending on who you asked, but Dionysus was there. The wandering god had come home, or at least he had a home to return to when he wasn't wandering. Yet even on Olympus, Dionysus remained different. He was the last to arrive. He was the only one with a mortal parent. He spent more time on earth than in the divine halls. He was the god who straddled worlds, who never quite belonged anywhere completely. And perhaps that's precisely why he mattered. The Greeks understood that the most important things often exist in the spaces between order and chaos, between civilization and nature, between the self we present to the world and the wild thing that lurks underneath. Dionysus was the god of those in-between spaces, and his most famous, most terrible demonstration of his power would come when he returned to his birthplace, to Thebes, to the very city where his mother had died and where his own divinity was still denied by those who should have honored him most. Homecomings in Greek mythology are rarely simple affairs. Odysseus spent 10 years trying to reach Ithaca, only to find his house overrun with suitors. Agamemnon returned from Troy to be murdered by his wife, and Dionysus's return to Thebes, the city of his birth, the place where his mother died, would prove equally fraught, equally tragic, and far more viscerally horrifying than either of those tales. By the time Dionysus returned to Thebes, he had traveled the world. He had established his worship in distant lands. He had gathered followers, performed miracles, demonstrated his divine power countless times. But Thebes, his home city, still didn't accept him. His mother's sisters, Semele's own siblings, claimed that their sister had lied. They said she hadn't really been impregnated by Zeus. They said she had been with a mortal man, gotten pregnant, and then made up the story about Zeus to cover her shame. They said Zeus had killed her for her blasphemy, for daring to claim divine paternity for her bastard child. This denial cut deep. These were his aunts, his family. And they were calling his mother a liar, calling him illegitimate, denying his very divinity. Dionysus arrived in Thebes quietly, disguised as a mortal priest of his own cult, a beautiful young man with long hair and a knowing smile. He came not with armies, but with his own particular brand of power. He was going to prove, once and for all, that he was a god. And the people of Thebes were going to learn what happened to those who denied him. He started with the women. All the women of Thebes, from the youngest to the oldest, high-born and low, including his 3 aunts, Agave, Ino, and Autonoe. Dionysus sent divine madness upon them. Not the violent, destructive madness he had inflicted on Lycurgus, but a different kind. An ecstatic, joyful madness. The women heard his call and couldn't resist. They dropped their weaving, abandoned their domestic duties, left their homes and husbands and children. They dressed in fawn skins, crowned themselves with ivy, took up thyrsus staffs, fennel stalks wrapped with ivy and topped with pine cones, and they went to the mountain, to Mount Cithaeron, outside the city walls, where they danced and sang and celebrated their new god. The men of Thebes watched this exodus with growing alarm. This wasn't normal behavior. This wasn't acceptable. The women were out there in the wilderness, unsupervised, engaging in who knows what kind of activities with this strange foreign priest and his exotic religion. Something had to be done, and the person who had to do it was Pentheus, the young king of Thebes, grandson of Cadmus, son of Agave, Dionysus's own cousin. Pentheus was, by all accounts, the worst possible person to deal with a crisis involving Dionysian worship. He was rigid, authoritarian, obsessed with order and control. He valued rationality, discipline, and traditional social structures. The very idea of women running wild on a mountain, worshipping some foreign god with wine and dancing, appalled him on every level. He saw it as a threat to public morality, to Theban society, to his own authority as king, and he was determined to put a stop to it. When the disguised Dionysus was brought before him, Pentheus saw only an effeminate foreigner, a charlatan corrupting Theban women with superstitious nonsense and probably worse. Pentheus questioned him, insulted him, and finally had him imprisoned. He was going to make an example of this so-called priest. He was going to show the city that he was in control, that these foreign rites would not be tolerated, that traditional order would be maintained. Dionysus, of course, escaped with ease. Prisons don't hold gods. The palace shook with an earthquake. Flames burst from Semele's tomb, and Dionysus walked out of his cell as casually as one walks out of a room. Pentheus emerged from the chaos to find his prisoner standing there, smiling, unharmed, and clearly something more than human. But Pentheus, stubborn and blind, didn't see the truth even when it was staring him in the face. He remained convinced that he could suppress this cult by force. He gathered his soldiers, prepared to march to Mount Cithaeron, to drag the women back by force if necessary, to arrest all these bacchantes and end this madness once and for all. And then Dionysus changed tactics. Instead of resisting Pentheus, instead of fighting him, Dionysus did something far more devastating. He played on the king's curiosity. He suggested, almost casually, that Pentheus might want to see what the women were actually doing up on the mountain. Wouldn't it be useful to know exactly what these rites involved? Wouldn't it help in suppressing them to understand them first? Pentheus hesitated. But curiosity is a powerful thing, especially when mixed with prurient interest. The idea of women running wild on a mountain, engaged in secret rituals, had clearly captured Pentheus's imagination in ways he probably didn't fully acknowledge even to himself. He wanted to see, he wanted to know, but he couldn't just walk up there as king. The women would see him coming, would hide whatever they were really doing. Dionysus had a solution. Pentheus should disguise himself, dress as a woman, go in secret, spy on the rites, see the truth for himself. And Pentheus, foolish and doomed, agreed. He let Dionysus dress him in women's clothing, let the god arrange his hair and adjust his costume. He let himself be led to the mountain like a lamb to slaughter. Here's where Euripides' play, the Bacchae, becomes most chilling. Dionysus leads Pentheus to Cytheron, helps him climb a tall tree to get a better view of the dancing women below. And then, with Pentheus perched in the branches, exposed and vulnerable, Dionysus reveals himself. He points out the spy to the Maenads. He tells the frenzied women that there's a man among them, a man who has come to mock their rites, who has opposed their god, who deserves punishment. The women, Pentheus's own mother Agave among them, look up and see not a man but a wild beast, a lion perhaps, or a young bull, some animal to be hunted. Dionysus has twisted their perception, has made them see a threat instead of a human, a creature instead of family. They swarm the tree. Pentheus tries to reason with them, tries to call out to his mother, but in their ecstatic frenzy they can't hear him, can't recognize him, can't see him for what he is. They pull down the tree, they drag Pentheus to the ground, and then they tear him apart. This is sparagmos, the ritual dismemberment, the same fate that Dionysus himself suffered in the Orphic myths. They rip him limb from limb with their bare hands, these women who are mothers and daughters and sisters, these respectable Theban ladies who in their normal state couldn't hurt anyone. But in Dionysian possession they have supernatural strength, and they're being directed by a god who has a score to settle. Agave, his mother, is the first to attack. She grabs Pentheus's arm and tears it off. The other women join in, competing to claim parts of the fallen king. They shred his body, scattering the pieces across Mount Cytheron. And when it's done, when there's nothing left but fragments, Agave claims the prize. She takes Pentheus's head, impales it on her thyrsus, and carries it back to Thebes in triumph. She's still mad, still possessed by Dionysian frenzy. And in her delusion she believes she has killed a lion. She parades into the city, calling for her father, calling for her son, wanting to show them her great hunting trophy. She's proud. She's boasting. She wants everyone to admire what she's accomplished in the wilds of Cytheron. It's Cadmus, the old king, Pentheus's grandfather, who breaks the spell. Gently, carefully, he guides Agave back to sanity. He makes her look closely at what she's carrying, makes her see, really see, what's impaled on her staff. And slowly, horribly, the madness lifts, the frenzy fades, and Agave realizes what she's done. She's holding her son's head. His eyes are still open, staring at nothing. She killed him. She tore him apart with her own hands, and she can never, never undo it. This is the climax of the Bacchae, one of the most disturbing scenes in all of Greek tragedy. The horror isn't the violence itself, though that's certainly present. The horror is the aftermath, the moment when the veil lifts and you see what you've done, the moment when divine possession gives way to human consciousness, and you have to live with the consequences of what happened while you were gone. Dionysus appears then, finally revealing himself in his true divine form. He shows no mercy. He shows no regret. He explains, calmly and clearly, that this is what happens when you deny him. This is the price of disbelief. Pentheus denied his divinity, tried to suppress his worship, and has paid with his life. The royal house of Thebes, Those who claimed Semele lied, who said Dionysus was no god. They've all learned their lesson. Some lessons, though, come too late to matter. The play ends with the royal family in ruins. Agave and her sisters must go into exile, cursed to wander. Cadmus, the great founder of Thebes, loses everything in his old age. The city itself is left traumatized. And Dionysus. Dionysus goes on to the next city, the next place that needs to learn what he is, the next set of deniers who will have to be taught. There's a question that lingers after reading the Bacchae. Is Dionysus evil? Is he a villain? He certainly doesn't act like the benevolent gods we might prefer. He manipulates, he deceives, he drives people mad and makes them do terrible things. He punishes those who oppose him with a cruelty that seems excessive, disproportionate. Pentheus was arrogant and foolish, yes, but did he deserve to be torn apart by his own mother? But perhaps that's the wrong question. Dionysus isn't evil. He's inhuman. He's a force of nature given personality. He's the principle of ecstasy and release, and like all profound experiences, he contains both joy and terror. You can't have the liberation he offers without accepting the danger. You can't have the transcendence without the risk. The same power that brings ecstasy can bring destruction. The same force that lets you transcend your everyday self can make you forget who you are entirely. The Greeks understood this. They didn't worship Dionysus because he was nice. They worshipped him because he was necessary. They worshipped him because sometimes you need to let the wild thing out. Sometimes you need to break the rules, to step outside yourself, to touch something bigger and more primal than your everyday life allows. And they worshipped him because to deny that need, to pretend it doesn't exist, to try to suppress it entirely, was to court disaster. Pentheus tried to maintain perfect control, perfect rationality, perfect order, and it destroyed him. The women of Thebes, released from their normal constraints, experienced something powerful and terrible. The lesson isn't that one should abandon all restraint, isn't that civilization should be abolished in favor of Bacchic frenzy. The lesson is that there needs to be a space for both. Order and wildness, Apollo and Dionysus, reason and ecstasy. The Greeks made room for both. They gave Dionysus his festivals, his sanctioned times and spaces where the normal rules were suspended. And then, when the festival ended, everyone went back to their regular lives. But what happened on those mountains during those festivals? What did the Maenads actually do? Let's venture into the wilds and meet the women who followed Dionysus with such devotion that they could forget themselves entirely. Picture them. Women streaming out of Greek cities, leaving behind their looms and their children, their domestic duties and their careful respectability. They head for the mountains, for the forests, for the wild places beyond civilization's edge. They wear fawn skins draped over their shoulders, ivy wreaths crown their unbound hair. They carry thyrsus staffs, those fennel stalks wrapped in ivy and topped with pine cones. And as they climb higher, as the city falls away behind them, something changes. The women begin to dance. These were the Maenads. The name comes from the Greek word mainomai, which means to rage, to be mad, to be frenzied. The Romans called them Bacchae or Bacchantes, after Bacchus, their name for Dionysus. And they were the god's most devoted followers, his primary worshippers, the ones who experienced his divine possession most directly and completely. Who were they really, these mad women of myth? The sources paint different pictures. Sometimes they're described as supernatural beings, nymphs or spirits who were Dionysus's nurses when he was young. Sometimes they're mortal women, housewives and mothers and daughters, who became something else when Dionysus called to them. The truth, such as it is, probably lies somewhere in between. The Maenads were a religious phenomenon, real women who participated in real rites, but their activities were mythologized, exaggerated, turned into cautionary tales and wonder stories. What we know is this: Dionysian worship involved women leaving their homes, usually at night, usually in groups, and going to secluded places to perform rites in honor of their god. These rites involved music and dancing, particularly to the beat of drums and the sound of flutes. They involved wine, though probably not to the point of mere drunkenness. They involved altered states of consciousness, achieved through some combination of rhythmic movement, music, fasting, sleep deprivation, and possibly other substances mixed with the wine. and they involved what the Greeks called enthusiasm, possession by the divine, becoming one with the god. The word enthusiasm comes from entheos, literally God within. When you were enthusiastic in the original Greek sense, you were filled with divine presence. You were a vessel for the god's power. You were simultaneously yourself and not yourself. And this possession manifested in particular ways. The Maenads were said to have supernatural strength. They could tear apart animals with their bare hands, a practice called sparagmos. They could nurse wild animals, even dangerous ones like wolves or lions, treating them like babies. They could strike the ground with their thyrsus staffs and make milk, honey, or wine flow from the earth. How much of this was literal? How much was metaphorical? We'll never know for certain. The rites were secret, reserved for initiates. Ancient sources, particularly male sources, wrote about them with a mixture of fascination, fear, and disapproval. We're seeing the Maenads through a distorted lens, through the eyes of people who were simultaneously drawn to and repelled by what they represented. But we can make some educated guesses. The dancing was real. Ecstatic dancing as a religious practice is found in cultures all over the world, and it's a proven method for inducing altered states of consciousness. Dance for hours to repetitive drum beats, in a group at night, in an isolated location, and you will experience something. Your sense of self will start to blur. Your normal inhibitions will fall away. You might feel like you're outside your body, like something else is moving through you. The supernatural strength was probably real too, at least in some sense. People in altered states can do things they normally couldn't, not because they gain new abilities, but because they bypass the mental limiters that usually stop us from using our full strength. A mother lifting a car off her trapped child isn't developing super strength in that moment. She's accessing strength she always had, but normally can't reach. The Maenads, in their frenzy, could probably do similar things. Tear apart animals, for instance, which sounds impossible until you remember that human jaws and hands are quite capable of ripping flesh if the mind is willing. And the sparagmos, the ritual dismemberment of animals, probably happened. Most scholars think it was part of the actual rites, a sacrifice to Dionysus that recreated his own mythological dismemberment. The animal, usually a goat or a fawn, would be caught and torn apart by the Maenads. Sometimes they would eat the raw flesh, a practice called homophagia. This sounds horrifying to modern sensibilities, but it made sense in the context of the religion. You were consuming the divine. The animal represented Dionysus or embodied his spirit, and by eating it raw immediately, you were taking that spirit into yourself. The whole practice was about breaking boundaries. Boundaries between human and animal, between civilized and wild, between self and other, between the individual and the divine. Normal Greek religion involved carefully structured rituals, animal sacrifices performed by priests at temples, offerings made according to precise formulae. Dionysian worship threw all that out. It was visceral, immediate, physical, wild. It was religion of the body, not just the mind. And it was primarily a religion for women. This is crucial to understanding the Maenads. Women in ancient Greece lived highly restricted lives. They were confined to the household, expected to manage domestic affairs and bear children, but excluded from politics, from philosophy, from most of public life. Their sexuality was controlled. Their movements were monitored. They had little autonomy, little freedom, little opportunity to be anything other than wives, mothers, daughters. But in Dionysian worship, all that fell away. On the mountain at night in the god's presence, a Greek housewife could be wild. She could run free. She could dance until she collapsed. She could scream and sing and let her hair down, literally and figuratively. She could experience power, including physical power, the ability to do things with her body that her normal life never allowed. She could be something other than her daily identity. This was deeply threatening to Greek men, which is why you see such fear and hostility toward the Maenads in male-authored texts. The image of women out there in the dark, unsupervised, doing who knows what, possibly engaging in sexual activities, possibly forming bonds with each other that excluded men, possibly experiencing pleasures and freedoms that challenged the entire social order. That image haunted Greek literature. But it also drew people. It was alluring. The Maenads represented something powerful and attractive, even as they represented something dangerous. And here's the paradox. Dionysian worship was both wildly subversive and officially sanctioned. Yes, it broke social norms. Yes, it temporarily upended gender hierarchies and conventional morality, but it did so in a controlled way, at prescribed times, in ritual contexts. The Maenads went to the mountain during specific festivals. They performed their rites, and then they came back. They returned to their normal lives, to being wives and mothers and daughters. The wildness was temporary, bounded, ritualized. This is what Pentheus failed to understand. He saw the chaos and wanted to suppress it entirely. He couldn't grasp that the chaos was part of the point, that it served a function, that it was necessary. The Greeks understood what many modern societies have forgotten. If you don't give people an outlet, if you don't create spaces where the pressure can be released, it will explode unpredictably. Better to have festivals, to have sanctioned times and spaces for wildness, than to try to maintain perfect control at all times. The Maenads then were both real and mythological. Real women participated in real Dionysian rites that involved real altered states of consciousness. But those rites were also mythologized, turned into stories about supernatural women with impossible abilities. The historical Maenads and the mythological Maenads coexisted, influencing each other, creating a rich and complex tradition that lasted for centuries. They were the women who knew how to let go, who knew how to become someone else for a night, who knew that sometimes you need to step outside yourself to remember who you really are. They were Dionysus's greatest gift to the women of Greece, and simultaneously one of the most controversial aspects of his worship. They were liberation and danger, ecstasy and madness, self-discovery and self-loss, all wrapped up in fawn skins and ivy wreaths. But the Maenads weren't the only way the Greeks experienced Dionysus. The god had another domain, equally important, where his influence shaped Greek culture in ways that endure to this day. We need to talk about theater. Let's shift scenes now from the wild mountain to the great city, from frenzied women dancing in firelight to orderly rows of citizens sitting in stone seats, from ecstatic possession to carefully scripted drama, from chaos to art. Because Dionysus, god of madness and wine, was also improbably the patron god of theater, and the festivals held in his honor gave birth to the entire Western dramatic tradition. The theater of Dionysus in Athens stood at the foot of the Acropolis, carved into the southern slope of the sacred hill. It could seat somewhere between 15,000 and 17,000 people, a staggering number, a significant portion of the city's population. The seats were stone, arranged in a semicircle facing the stage. The front rows were reserved for priests and important officials. Behind them, the citizens. Higher up, perhaps, the metics, resident foreigners. And somewhere, though scholars debate exactly where women, if they were allowed to attend at all. This theatre was the center of the city Dionysia, the Great Dionysia, the most important dramatic festival in the Greek world. It was held every spring, in late March or early April by our calendar, lasting for 5 or 6 days. And it was enormous. Not just a religious festival, not just a theatrical event, but a massive civic celebration that drew visitors from all over Greece. The festival began with a procession, a Pompeii. Picture this. A wooden statue of Dionysus was carried through the streets of Athens, from his temple to the theatre. Citizens accompanied it, thousands of them, dressed in their finest clothes. There were sacrifices, bulls slaughtered in honor of the god. There were dithyrambs, choral hymns sung by groups of men and boys representing the 10 Athenian tribes, competing for prizes. There were giant phalloi carried in the procession, symbols of fertility and generation, Dionysus's gifts to humanity. And then came the drama. 3 days devoted to tragedy. Each day, one playwright would present 4 plays, a trilogy of tragedies followed by a satyr play, a lighter, bawdier piece to relieve the emotional intensity. These were new works, written specifically for the festival, premiered before thousands of spectators. The playwrights not only wrote the plays, but also composed the music, choreographed the dances, and directed the performances. They were, in the truest sense, the creators of these dramas. And what dramas they were. Aeschylus's Oresteia, which traced the curse on the house of Atreus through 3 generations of murder and revenge, Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, where a man discovers he has unwittingly killed his father and married his mother. Euripides' Medea, where a wronged woman murders her own children to punish her unfaithful husband. These weren't light entertainments. These were profound explorations of human nature, of fate and free will, of justice and revenge, of the relationship between mortals and gods. And they were performed in honor of Dionysus. Why? What did tragedy have to do with wine and ecstasy? The connection seems obscure at first, but it makes sense once you think about it. Dionysus was the god of transformation, of becoming other than yourself. What is acting but exactly that? When an actor puts on a mask and steps onto the stage, he ceases to be himself. He becomes a character. He transforms. The masks themselves were sacred to Dionysus. Greek actors wore large masks that completely covered their faces, with exaggerated features and wide-open mouths that helped project their voices in those huge outdoor theaters. These masks allowed one actor to play multiple roles by simply changing his face. They allowed men to play women and gods to appear before mortals. The mask was the ultimate symbol of Dionysian transformation. Behind it, you could be anyone. You could be everyone. You were simultaneously yourself and not yourself, human and character, individual and archetype. And the content of the tragedies resonated with Dionysian themes, even when they weren't explicitly about Dionysus. They dealt with boundaries crossed, with taboos violated, with the consequences of hubris and the terror of fate. They showed humans at their most extreme, driven by passion or madness or divine influence, to do things that horrified themselves and their audiences. The tragedies were controlled chaos, ritual reenactments of the darkest aspects of human experience, performed in a sacred space witnessed by the entire community. Watching tragedy was itself a kind of ecstatic experience. Aristotle would later describe it as catharsis, a purging of emotions through pity and fear. You sat there for hours, you watched these terrible events unfold, you felt the emotions of the characters, and when it was over, something had shifted inside you. You had experienced something powerful, something transformative, something that took you outside your normal state and then returned you, changed. After the tragedies came comedy. Usually 5 comedians would each present one play on a single day. These were very different from the tragedies. Whereas tragedy dealt with myth and the distant past, comedy was contemporary, often savagely satirical, making fun of politicians and philosophers and current events. Aristophanes, the great comic playwright, wrote plays where the hero makes peace with Sparta by himself, or where women go on a sex strike to end a war, or where the dead playwright Euripides is brought back from Hades. Comedy was irreverent, bawdy, frequently obscene, filled with jokes about genitals and bodily functions, and this too was very Dionysian. The god presided over high tragedy and low comedy with equal authority. He encompassed both, the serious and the ridiculous, the sublime and the obscene. Dionysus wasn't just about one thing. He was about the full range of human experience and expression. He was about breaking down boundaries, including the boundary between the tragic and the comic, the sacred and the profane. The city Dionysia was more than entertainment. It was civic ritual, religious ceremony, and artistic showcase all combined. It was Athens, showing off its cultural achievements to the Greek world. Allies and subject states would bring tribute payments during the festival, literally presenting their money in the theater before the plays began. War orphans, sons of Athenians who died in battle, would parade through the theater wearing armor provided by the state, demonstrating that Athens cared for its own. Honors would be announced, civic business conducted, all as part of the festival, and at the end, judges would vote on the best plays. Winning the city Dionysia was one of the highest honors a playwright could receive. Your name would be inscribed on the public records. You would be remembered. The victory was both artistic and religious. You had pleased not only the audience, but also Dionysus himself. The theater, then, was sacred space. The plays were religious offerings. The actors were performing a service to the god. And the audience was participating in a communal religious experience every bit as much as the Maenads dancing on Mount Cithaeron. Different manifestation, same divine power. The god of ecstasy could work through dance and frenzy or through structured drama and performed emotion. Both were transformative. Both took you outside yourself. Both made you feel something bigger than your individual existence. This is why theatre endured. Long after the specific religious context faded, long after people stopped believing in the Olympian gods, theatre remained. Because what Dionysus offered through drama was something fundamental to human experience. The chance to witness other lives, other possibilities, other ways of being. The chance to feel emotions safely, to experience catharsis, to think about difficult questions through the medium of story and performance. The chance to come together as a community and share a collective experience. Every play, every film, every television show, every form of dramatic storytelling we have today traces its lineage back to those festivals in ancient Athens, to those competitions held in honor of Dionysus. When you watch a play or a movie and lose yourself in the story, when you feel what the characters feel, when you come out changed in some small way by what you've witnessed, you're experiencing a descendant of Dionysian worship. The masks have gotten more sophisticated. The theatrical technology has advanced. But the core experience, the transformation through witnessing, remains the same. Dionysus gave the Greeks both the Maenads and the theatre, ecstasy and art, wild frenzy and structured performance, and he showed them that both were necessary, that both were sacred, that the human spirit needed both the release of the one and the catharsis of the other. The god of wine was also the god of masks, and in that combination he revealed something profound about what it means to be human. But we've been talking a lot about violence and madness, about tearing things apart and ecstatic frenzy. Let's shift gears. Let's talk about love. Because Dionysus had a gentler side too, a romantic side, and his relationship with Ariadne is one of the most beautiful love stories in all of Greek mythology. Some love stories begin with eyes meeting across a crowded room. Some begin with a chance encounter on a busy street. Dionysus's love story began with him finding a woman sleeping on a beach, weeping in her sleep, abandoned by the hero she had sacrificed everything to help. It's not the most conventional romance, but then again Dionysus was not the most conventional god. Ariadne was a princess of Crete, daughter of King Minos, the same Minos who kept the Minotaur in the labyrinth beneath his palace. When Theseus arrived from Athens, one of the group of young men and women sent as tribute to be devoured by the monster, Ariadne saw him and fell in love. She gave him the thread that allowed him to navigate the labyrinth, the thread that saved his life and the lives of his companions. She betrayed her father and her city for this hero. She fled with him when he escaped, leaving behind everything she had ever known. They stopped at Naxos on their journey back to Athens. Accounts vary on exactly what happened next. Some say Theseus abandoned her deliberately, leaving in the night while she slept, perhaps tired of her, perhaps regretting taking her, perhaps having fallen in love with someone else. Other versions say Dionysus appeared to Theseus in a dream and commanded him to leave Ariadne there, claiming her for himself. Still others suggest Ariadne herself chose to stay, drawn by something she sensed on the island by the presence of the god. However it happened, Ariadne woke alone. Imagine that moment. You've given up everything for someone, your home, your family, your future. You've committed treason, essentially, helping this foreigner kill your city's sacred guardian and escape. And you wake up on a strange island to find he's gone. The ship is sailing away, you're alone, with nothing, with no one, abandoned in every sense of the word. Ariadne wept. Who wouldn't? She had no way to go home, no way to follow Theseus, no money, no resources, no plan. She was stranded and heartbroken, a princess reduced to a castaway. The myths say she cried herself to exhaustion there on the beach, and eventually fell asleep again, tear-stained and desperate. And that's when Dionysus found her. He was on Naxos, possibly because it was sacred to him, possibly just passing through. He saw this beautiful woman lying on the shore, obviously distraught, and he was captivated. Some versions say he had orchestrated the whole thing, that he had wanted Ariadne from the beginning, and arranged for Theseus to abandon her. Others present it as a fortunate accident, at least from Dionysus's perspective. He woke her gently. Imagine opening your eyes from that nightmare of abandonment to see a god standing over you, young and beautiful, looking at you with interest and concern. Dionysus spoke to her kindly. He asked why she was crying. He offered comfort. And he offered her something Theseus never could have, not just love, but immortality, not just companionship, but divinity itself. Different versions tell different details of their courtship. In some, Ariadne was immediately taken with the god, grateful to have been rescued, ready to move on from her faithless hero. In others, she was resistant at first, still in love with Theseus, still mourning what she had lost. But Dionysus was patient. He courted her properly. He gave her gifts, including a crown, a beautiful diadem set with jewels, either made by Hephaestus or given to him by Aphrodite. Some versions say the crown glowed with its own light, radiant as stars. Ariadne eventually said yes. She married Dionysus, and he loved her with a devotion that seems at odds with his reputation as a wild, dangerous god. He didn't just take her as a lover. He made her his wife, his consort, his equal in important ways. He brought her to Olympus, and he did something beautiful and lasting. He took that jeweled crown he had given her and threw it into the heavens, where it became a constellation. Corona Borealis, the northern crown, a circle of stars that would shine forever, a testament to his love for her. They had children together, several sons, including Oenopion, who would become a king in his own right, and Staphylos, whose name means grape cluster. Some traditions give them a daughter as well. They were, by all accounts, happy together. Ariadne had found a love that was constant, that wouldn't abandon her, that would last eternally. Different traditions give different fates for Ariadne. Some say she lived forever as an immortal goddess, presiding alongside Dionysus over his rites and festivals. Others say she remained mortal and eventually died, but that Dionysus descended into the underworld to retrieve her, much as Orpheus tried to retrieve Eurydice. Except Dionysus succeeded. He brought Ariadne back from death, made her immortal, and they ascended to Olympus together. Either way, their story has a happy ending, which is rare in Greek mythology. The story of Dionysus and Ariadne offers a different facet of the god. Not Dionysus the destroyer, not the god who drives people mad and punishes those who oppose him. This is Dionysus the lover, the devoted husband, the god who could be tender and constant. He saw a woman at her lowest point, broken and abandoned, and he lifted her up. He offered her not just comfort, but elevation. He turned her abandonment into her salvation. There's something deeply appealing about this myth. The idea that your worst moment might lead to your best outcome. The idea that when one love fails, another might be waiting, something better than you could have imagined. Ariadne thought her life was over when Theseus left her. Instead, it was just beginning. She thought she had lost everything, but she was about to gain infinitely more. And for Dionysus, Ariadne represented stability. Throughout all his wandering, throughout all his punishments and demonstrations of power, throughout all his travels and trials, Ariadne was there. She was his anchor, his home, the one person who chose him freely and stayed with him willingly. She wasn't driven mad. She wasn't coerced. She didn't worship him out of fear. She simply loved him, and he loved her back, and that love endured. The image of Dionysus and Ariadne together became a popular subject for ancient art. Vases, mosaics, paintings, sculptures, all showing the divine couple in various scenes. Sometimes the moment of discovery on the beach, Dionysus first seeing the sleeping Ariadne. Sometimes their wedding feast, surrounded by satyrs and nymphs. Sometimes just the two of them together, relaxed and content, the wild god domesticated by love. But domestication is perhaps the wrong word. Dionysus remained Dionysus with all that entailed, but Ariadne's presence in his mythology softened him, gave him depth, showed that the god of ecstasy could also commit, could also love steadily, could also be faithful. It's a side of him that doesn't appear in the stories of Pentheus or Lycurgus, but it's no less real for that. And Ariadne herself, in marrying Dionysus, became something more than she was. She became a goddess in her own right, worshipped alongside her husband in various places. She had festivals of her own in Cyprus and on Naxos. She was honored, remembered, elevated. The princess who helped a hero became a goddess who stood beside a god. Not bad for a woman who started the day abandoned on a beach. Their story reminds us that Dionysus wasn't just about madness and chaos. He was also about transformation, yes, but transformation could be positive. It could be loving. It could lift you up instead of tearing you apart. The same God who could drive you insane could also make you divine. The same power that destroyed Pentheus saved Ariadne. The difference was in how you approached the god, and perhaps in how the god chose to approach you. But we're not done with Dionysus yet. We've talked about his myths, his worship, his relationships. Now we need to talk about the mystery cults, those secret rites that promised initiates transformation and salvation, that saw in Dionysus not just a god of wine and theatre, but a god of death and rebirth, a god who could promise something beyond this life. Picture a torchlit cave. Picture robed figures speaking in whispers, performing rituals whose exact nature you'll never know because initiates swore oaths never to reveal them. Picture promises of a blessed afterlife, of escape from the endless cycle of reincarnation, of union with the divine. Picture Dionysus not as the cheerful god of wine, but as a dark, chthonic deity, a god of the underworld as much as of the vine. This was Dionysus in the mystery cults, and it was a very different vision of the god than what appeared in public festivals. Mystery religions were a major feature of ancient Greek and Roman religious life. Unlike the public state cults, which anyone could participate in, mystery cults required initiation. You couldn't just show up. You had to be inducted, taught secrets, undergo transformative experiences that marked you as an insider. And you could never ever tell non-initiates what happened in those rites. The penalty for revealing the mysteries was death, at least in theory, and certainly social ostracism. Dionysian mystery cults were among the most important and enduring. They existed alongside the public worship of Dionysus, offering something deeper, more personal, more transformative. While the city Dionysia was about civic celebration and theatrical performance, the Dionysian mysteries were about personal salvation and spiritual transformation. The core of these mysteries involved the myth of Dionysus's death and resurrection. Particularly in Orphic traditions, which were closely associated with Dionysian worship, the story of Zagreus was central. Remember that version of Dionysus's birth, where he was torn apart by Titans as an infant, but his heart was saved and he was reborn. That story wasn't just a variant myth, it was the foundation of an entire religious worldview. The Orphics, named after the legendary musician Orpheus who supposedly founded or reformed the cult, taught that humans were made from the ashes of the Titans. When Zeus destroyed the Titans with his lightning bolt after they ate Zagreus, their ashes fell to earth, and from those ashes humanity was born. This meant that every human contained both the evil nature of the Titans and the divine essence of Dionysus, whom the Titans had consumed. We are, according to Orphic teaching, both god and monster, both light and dark, eternally torn between our better and worse natures. But there was hope. Through proper ritual, through initiation into the mysteries, through living a pure life, you could purify yourself of the Titanic element and strengthen the Dionysian element. You could escape the cycle of reincarnation, the endless rebirth into new bodies, and achieve union with the divine. You could become, in essence, a god yourself, or at least partake of divinity more fully. The Dionysian mysteries promised this transformation through ritual death and rebirth. Initiates would undergo experiences designed to mirror Dionysus's own dismemberment and resurrection. The exact details remain secret, even now, lost with the death of the last initiates. But we can piece together some elements from hints in ancient sources. There were likely purification rituals, fasting and bathing to prepare the body. There were probably sacrifices, possibly including the sparagmos and omophagia we discussed earlier, the tearing apart and eating of an animal to consume the divine. There were certainly performances, dramatic reenactments of mythological scenes, with the initiate perhaps playing the role of Dionysus himself, experiencing the god's suffering and resurrection. And there was wine. But not just wine as intoxicant, wine as sacrament, wine as the literal blood of the god, transformed grapes, death and fermentation turned into something that brings joy and alteration of consciousness. To drink wine in the Dionysian mysteries was to consume the god, to take him into yourself, to become one with the divine. There were probably also hallucinogens or other consciousness-altering substances, mixed with the wine. Some scholars have suggested that the magic potion associated with Dionysian rites might have contained psychoactive herbs. Ancient Greeks had access to various plants that could produce visions, and it wouldn't be surprising if the mystery cults used them. Altered states of consciousness were central to Dionysian worship, and there are many ways to achieve such states beyond just wine. The Eleusinian mysteries, which were focused on Demeter and Persephone, had some overlap with Dionysian worship. In fact, some versions of the myth made Dionysus present at Eleusis, participating in the story of Persephone's abduction and return. This makes sense when you think about it. Both Persephone and Dionysus were gods who experienced death and returned from it. Both represented cycles of loss and return, death and rebirth. Both offered their initiates hope for a better afterlife. The mysteries spoke to something deep in human psychology. The fear of death, yes, but more than that. The sense that everyday life, with its mundane concerns and limited horizons, isn't enough. The hunger for transcendence, for meaning, for connection to something greater than ourselves. The mystery cults offered that connection. They offered transformation. They offered the promise that you could become more than you were, that death was not the end, that the divine was not distant but immediate and accessible. And Dionysus was particularly suited for this role. He was already the god of transformation, of stepping outside yourself, of losing your individual identity to merge with something larger. He had already experienced death and rebirth in myth. He already offered his followers the experience of ecstasy, of being possessed by the divine. The mystery cults just took these elements and formalized them, made them into a path toward salvation. The influence of Orphism and the Dionysian mysteries extended far beyond their immediate practitioners. Plato was deeply influenced by Orphic ideas, particularly the concept of the immortal soul and the need for purification. Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans adopted Orphic practices, including vegetarianism and various purification rites. And later, when Christianity began to spread through the Roman world, it would borrow imagery and concepts from these mystery cults. The idea of a dying and resurrecting God, the communal meal of bread and wine, the promise of eternal life to initiates, the notion of being born again into a new spiritual state. All of these had precedence in the Dionysian mysteries. This doesn't mean Christianity was merely copying pagan rites, but it does mean that when early Christians tried to explain their new faith to people raised in Greco-Roman culture, they used familiar concepts, familiar language, familiar imagery, and much of that familiarity came from the mystery cults, particularly the Dionysian ones. The mysteries lasted for centuries. They survived the transition from Greek city-states to Hellenistic kingdoms to Roman Empire. They were suppressed occasionally, particularly when they seemed politically threatening or sexually transgressive, but they always came back. Finally, with the rise of Christianity and the suppression of pagan religions in the late Roman period, they died out. The last mystery cults were forcibly closed in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era. The temples were destroyed or converted to churches, the priests were killed or converted, the rituals stopped, and with them died secrets that we'll never recover. We'll never know exactly what happened in those torchlit caves. We'll never know exactly what initiates saw and felt and experienced. We'll never know the full details of the rituals that promised transformation and salvation. All we have are fragments, hints, second-hand accounts from outsiders, and the knowledge that for hundreds of thousands of people over more than 1,000 years, these mysteries mattered profoundly. Dionysus, the mystery god, the god of death and rebirth, existed alongside Dionysus, the wine god, and Dionysus, the theater god. All were real. All were important. The Greeks were comfortable with this multiplicity, this complexity. Their gods weren't simple. They didn't have just one aspect, one domain, one way of relating to mortals. Dionysus could be all these things at once, joyful and terrifying, public and secret, wild and sacred. And to understand him fully, you needed to know all these facets. The reveler and the mystic, the god of the festival and the god of the hidden rite, the bringer of ecstasy and the promiser of salvation. He was all of it, and the Greeks honored all of it, each in its proper place and time. Every god had their symbols. those items and animals and plants that identified them, that appeared in their depictions, that carried meaning beyond the merely decorative. Zeus had his thunderbolt and eagle. Athena had her owl and aegis. Poseidon had his trident. And Dionysus. Dionysus had a whole collection of symbols, each one telling you something about who he was and what he represented. Start with the thyrsus. This was the staff carried by Dionysus and his followers, and it's probably his most distinctive symbol. Picture a long wooden staff, made from a giant fennel stalk, wrapped with ivy vines and topped with a pine cone. Sometimes it's depicted with ribbons attached, sometimes with grape leaves intertwined with the ivy. It doesn't look particularly impressive, more like a decorated walking stick than a weapon or tool of power. But the thyrsus was powerful. In myth, striking the ground with a thyrsus could make water, milk, wine, or honey flow from the earth. Maenads used their thyrsus staffs to perform miracles, and when turned against an enemy, it could be deadly. When the women of Thebes attacked Pentheus, they used their thyrsus staffs as weapons, beating him with them before tearing him apart with their hands. The symbolism of the thyrsus is rich. The fennel stalk represented the wild, the natural world beyond human cultivation. Ivy was sacred to Dionysus, an evergreen plant that remained green even in winter, symbolizing eternal life and rebirth. The pine cone at the top was phallic, representing fertility and generation, but also suggested intoxication, as pine resins were sometimes added to wine. Together, these elements created a symbol of Dionysus's power over nature, his ability to bring forth abundance, his role as a god of fertility and transformation. Then there were the plants. Grapevine, obviously. Dionysus was first and foremost the god of wine, and the grapevine was his primary sacred plant. But also ivy, which we've mentioned, and bindweed, another climbing vine. These plants that wrap around things, that climb and spread and cover, that transform their surroundings with their growth. Dionysus was associated with this kind of vigorous, spreading growth, this natural exuberance that couldn't be contained. Wine itself was obviously his most important gift to humanity. Not just the physical substance, but everything wine represented. Joy, celebration, social bonding, altered consciousness, the ability to see things differently, to loosen inhibitions. Transformation, as grapes became something entirely different through fermentation. Religious ecstasy, as wine opened pathways to the divine. The Greeks understood wine as a complex thing, neither purely good nor purely bad, but powerful and requiring respect. Dionysus was usually depicted holding a cantharos, a particular type of drinking cup with large handles. This wasn't just any cup, but a specific ritual vessel associated with his worship. In art, seeing a figure holding a cantharos was often enough to identify them as Dionysus or one of his followers. His sacred animals were equally telling. Leopards and panthers were most closely associated with him. He was often shown riding a panther or driving a chariot pulled by big cats. These exotic, dangerous animals represented his wild nature, his connection to distant lands, his untamed power. They were beautiful and lethal, like Dionysus himself. Bulls were also sacred to him. In some myths, Dionysus took the form of a bull. In the Bacchae, Pentheus hallucinates that Dionysus has bull horns. The bull represented masculine power, fertility, dangerous strength. It also connected to the practice of sparagmos, as bulls were sometimes the animals torn apart in Dionysian rites. Serpents appeared in Dionysian imagery too, snakes that the Maenads would handle or wear draped around their bodies. Snakes represented transformation through shedding their skins, chthonic power, dangerous wisdom. They connected Dionysus to the earth and the underworld, to the older, darker aspects of his worship. And goats, of course. The satyr companions of Dionysus were part goat, and goats were commonly sacrificed to him. The word tragedy comes from tragoidia, which means goat song, possibly referring to early Dionysian performances where a goat was the prize or sacrifice. Masks were crucial symbols. As the god of theatre, Dionysus was represented by the theatrical mask, particularly the smiling comic mask and the crying tragic mask. But beyond theatre, masks represented transformation itself. The ability to become someone else, the many faces of identity, the gap between appearance and reality. Dionysus was the god of masks because he understood that who we are is fluid, changeable, performed. His appearance in art evolved over time. Early depictions showed him as a mature, bearded man, dignified and authoritative, more like a wise king than a party god. But over the centuries he became younger, more androgynous, almost feminine in his beauty. By the classical period, Dionysus was typically shown as a beautiful young man with long hair, soft features, graceful posture. This femininity wasn't considered shameful. It was part of his nature, part of his liminality. He existed between categories, male and female, young and old, mortal and divine, Greek and foreign. His clothing in art was also notable. Unlike most male gods, who were often depicted nude or in simple garments, Dionysus wore elaborate robes, sometimes described as oriental in style, reinforcing his association with the exotic East. He might wear a leopard skin draped over his shoulders. He always wore an ivy crown or a wreath of grape leaves. All these symbols appeared together in Dionysian art and worship, creating a rich visual language. When you saw ivy and a thyrsus and a panther together, you knew you were in Dionysus's realm. When you heard the sound of drums and flutes, smelled wine and saw masks, you knew his presence was near. The symbols weren't just decorative, they were signifiers of divine power, markers of sacred space, reminders of what the god represented. And taken together, they painted a picture of a god who was about transformation, about wildness held in tension with cultivation, about the natural and the supernatural intertwined, about joy and danger as two sides of the same experience. You couldn't have one without the other. The wine that brings celebration can bring destruction. The ecstasy that frees you from yourself can consume you entirely. The wildness that liberates can also devastate. Dionysus's symbols told this story without words. They were the visual vocabulary of a complex theology, a sophisticated understanding of human nature and divine power. And they endured, appearing in art and literature for centuries, right up to the present day, still recognized, still powerful, still meaningful. So what did it all mean? What was Dionysus really about? We've talked about his birth and his travels, his punishment of Pentheus and his love for Ariadne, his role in theater and his mystery cults, his symbols and his worship. But stepping back, looking at the whole picture, what did this god represent to the Greeks? Why did he matter? Dionysus was the god of everything that civilization tries to control but can never fully contain. He was wine, which brings both joy and destruction. He was ecstasy, which takes you outside yourself, beyond your normal consciousness, beyond your civilized restraint. He was theater, which is both art and ritual, both entertainment and sacred ceremony. He was madness, the breaking down of rational thought, the eruption of forces that don't respond to logic or argument. He was transformation, the fluid state between one thing and another. The Greeks built a civilization based on reason, on logos, on clear thinking and rational inquiry. They invented democracy, philosophy, rigorous logical argument. They built temples with perfect proportions, made art that balanced ideal beauty with realistic representation. They valued sophrosin, that untranslatable virtue that means something like wisdom, soundness of mind, moderation, self-control. But they also understood that sophrosyne wasn't everything, that a life of pure rationality, pure control, pure order would be incomplete. Human beings need more than reason. We need passion. We need release. We need times and spaces where we can let go of control, where we can be wild, where we can step outside our everyday selves. Dionysus offered that space. His festivals were sanctioned chaos, permitted wildness, ritualized release. For a few days a year, the normal rules were suspended. Women could leave their houses, slaves could speak freely, sexual restraints loosened, social hierarchies collapsed. And then, when the festival ended, everyone went back to normal life. The pressure had been released, the balance had been maintained. This is why trying to suppress Dionysian worship was always a mistake. Pentheus tried it and died horribly. Lycurgus tried it and was punished by the gods. Roman authorities tried it with the Bacchanalia in 186 BCE and had to eventually accept a modified form of the rites. You can't suppress the human need for release, for ecstasy, for stepping outside yourself. You can only channel it, give it safe outlets, or watch it explode in unpredictable ways. Dionysus also represented the other, the foreign, the exotic. Even though he appeared in the earliest Greek records, even though Thebes claimed him as a native son, the Greeks always saw him as coming from somewhere else. From Thrace or India or Asia Minor, from the mysterious East with its strange customs and dangerous knowledge. This foreignness was essential to his character. He brought something into Greek culture that wasn't quite Greek, that challenged Greek assumptions about civilization and barbarity, about self and other. In a way, Dionysus was the god of empathy. Not in the modern sense of being nice and understanding, but in the original meaning of the word, empathia, feeling into, experiencing what others experience. When you drink wine and your inhibitions loosen, when you put on a mask and become a character in a play, when you're possessed by the god in ecstatic frenzy, you step outside your own limited perspective. You become capable of feeling what others feel, seeing as others see. You transcend the boundaries of your individual identity. This is what theatre does at its best. It makes you feel what the characters feel. It makes you understand perspectives different from your own. It creates empathy through performance and witness. And this is what the Dionysian mysteries promised. Union with the divine, transcendence of individual selfhood, connection to something larger than yourself. The Greeks saw all this clearly. They understood that Dionysus was necessary, that a culture needs both Apollo and Dionysus, both reason and ecstasy, both order and wildness. Nietzsche would later write about this in The Birth of Tragedy, arguing that Greek culture at its height achieved a perfect balance between Apollonian rationality and Dionysian passion, and that the decline of tragedy marked a shift toward excessive rationality that impoverished Greek culture. Whether you agree with Nietzsche or not, the basic insight is sound. Human beings need both. We need structure and we need release. We need clear thinking and we need passion. We need the everyday world and we need transcendence. Dionysus offered the transcendence, the wildness, the stepping outside yourself that balanced the structure and rationality of normal Greek life. His legacy extended far beyond ancient Greece. The Romans adopted him as Bacchus, and Bacchanalian festivals became famous or infamous throughout the Roman world. When Christianity spread, it absorbed Dionysian imagery and concepts. The mystery cults influenced early Christian theology and practice in ways scholars are still debating. The tradition of carnival, the pre-Lenten celebration where normal rules are suspended and wild behavior is permitted, may have roots in Dionysian festivals. And theatre, of course, Dionysus's greatest gift to human culture. Every play, every film, every television show, every form of dramatic storytelling descends from those competitions in ancient Athens. The theatre of Dionysus is long ruined, but the tradition it birthed is alive and thriving. We still use tragedy and comedy, the two dramatic forms that emerged from Dionysian festivals. We still wear masks, literal and metaphorical. We still understand the power of performance to transform both actor and audience. In modern times, Dionysus has been rediscovered and reimagined repeatedly. The Romantics saw him as a symbol of artistic inspiration and rebellion against rationality. Nietzsche made him central to his philosophy. The Beats and hippies of the 1960s embraced Dionysian values of ecstasy and liberation. Modern psychologists and scholars of mythology see him as representing important aspects of human psychology and spiritual experience. But perhaps the simplest way to understand Dionysus is this: he's the god who gives permission. Permission to let go. Permission to be wild. Permission to step outside your normal self. Permission to feel things deeply, to lose control sometimes, to experience ecstasy and transformation. The Greeks understood that everyone needs that permission occasionally, that a life of constant control and constant rationality and constant responsibility is not a fully human life. So they worshipped a god who offered the opposite, who said it's okay to dance on mountains, okay to lose yourself in wine and music, okay to cry watching a tragedy, okay to laugh at a comedy, okay to wear a mask and become someone else for a while. It's okay to be human in the full sense, not just the rational part, but the passionate part, the wild part, the part that wants to transcend everyday existence and touch something larger. That was Dionysus's gift. That was what he meant to the Greeks. And in a world that often seems to value rationality above all, that seems to demand constant productivity and constant self-control, maybe we need that gift more than ever. Maybe we need to remember that there's a god of wine and madness, of theater and transformation, who says it's not just okay but sacred to sometimes let go. Close your eyes again. Listen for the drums, the flutes, the voices calling in the darkness. Somewhere, always, the spirit of Dionysus is there, offering release, offering transformation, offering the chance to step outside yourself and discover what lies beyond your everyday consciousness. The god is waiting, he's always waiting. And when you're ready, when you need to let go, when you need to become more than you are, he'll be there, thyrsus in hand, ivy-crowned, smiling that knowing smile. Wine flows. Masks gleam in torchlight. The dance continues. And Dionysus, twice-born, wandering god, keeper of mysteries, patron of theatre, lover of Ariadne, destroyer of Pentheus, giver of ecstasy and madness, presides over it all. The god of wine and transformation, of death and rebirth, of wild places and sacred stages. Dionysus. Remember his name. Remember what he offers. And remember that the Greeks, in their wisdom, knew that some gods you don't just worship. You experience them. You become them, if only for a moment. And in that moment of transformation, of stepping outside yourself, of touching the divine, you discover something true about what it means to be human. And on that note, as we come to the end of this journey through Dionysian myth and mystery, if you enjoyed learning about the twice-born god, if you found something valuable in these tales of wine and madness, theatre and transformation, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. It helps others find these stories, these ancient myths that still speak to something deep in the human experience. Until next time, may your wine be sweet and your dances wild. May your masks fit well and your transformations be profound. And may you always remember that somewhere, on some mountain or stage or hidden grove, Dionysus is waiting, offering ecstasy, demanding recognition, giving permission to be more and other than what you are. Sleep well.